Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is yet another Ukraine war news video today. It's a day of quite a lot of content and a fair bit to get through in this geopolitical update concerning what is going on around the war in Ukraine and all the international machinations connected to the war. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and share. That would be fantastic. In fact, I've got a little bit of an icon there to remind you, just in case you need that multimodal approach to communication. Right, we're going to get stuck into a bit of politics. We're going to start with the sabotage that just took place this morning in Poland on the way to what's it yesterday actually on the railway tracks on the way to Ukraine in Poland. So let's start with that. So an armed attack on Poland is being prepared. The enemy has begun preparations for war, said the Chief of General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces. And this was said yesterday afternoon. There was then the claim that, Russia they didn't say Russia was behind this. They said it came from the east. And indeed, it is a little bit more complicated than one might think. So Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has come out and confirmed in Parliament that two Ukrainian nationals long linked to Russian intelligence carried out the recent railway sabotage. One was previously convicted for sabotage in Lviv. The other was from the Donbass. I think both have actually been involved on the wrong side of the law with regard to, treachery. Both had run away to Belarus and were living in Belarus and entered Poland in the autumn to then put explosives on the railway track in several places, it appears. So it's not so easy as the Russians what did it, even though it is the Russians what did it really. But this is where the Russians are clever, because if the more often that they can use Ukrainians to do this, pro-Russian Ukrainians, invariably from the east or from Crimea or wherever, then the more complicated it becomes and the less it seems like it's Russia that did it. But actually, Russia could argue that this was the activity of freedom fighters who were trying to fight for Ukraine to return back to the fold. So it wasn't Russia that did this. It was Ukrainians freely doing this, even though these two, it is thought, have very close connections to the Russian intelligence. It's all about plausible deniability. So this makes it much more complicated. And it's very clever when the Russians do get to use Ukrainians in this kind of way. I'm sure there'll be a lot more of that emerging over the next few days. Now, the US Senate is about to move on a Trump-backed Russia sanctions bill. Senator Lindsey Graham said, with the president's blessing, the Senate will move on the sanctions. But the legislation has been, as Tendar says here, the legislation is designed to give President Trump more flexibility and power to push Putin to the peace table by going after both Putin and countries like Iran that support him. As Lindsey Graham, I appreciate the strong bipartisan support for this legislation in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but written into the bill is the ultimate responsibility or ultimate power that Trump will have in enacting this bill. So, it might well get relatively easily through Congress, but Trump has demanded that written into it is his ability to trigger it or to repeal it. So it rests, unfortunately, with Trump. And we know that Trump is very volatile and not exactly inclined to put Putin and Russia under too much pressure, even though we have had the recent sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, which is doing very well. But I reckon that the way that Trump was convinced to put sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, and this is my speculation, of course, was that it would be to the benefit of American hydrocarbons industries. So, and they probably would have lobbied him for it, because the US is now saying, okay, please don't buy Russian oil and gas. But by the way, we sell a good line in LNG. So our liquefied natural gas that we can ship pretty much anywhere around the world, we can sell you that. So I think the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil might have been something that Trump was more inclined to do, because this was it's a zero-sum game sort of thing. Trump loves this kind of evaluation, which is your loss is our gain. You won't be selling your hydrocarbons to these countries because we will be selling it. Whereas if it was some other kind of some other type of pressure that was either more abstract or didn't involve so much obvious gain for the US, then I wonder whether Trump would have been so interested. Right, moving on, US sanctions exemption. So we've got a number of different things going on. So Lukoil, Rosneft sanctions, but then we have, so this is the idea that we're going to be really strong on Russia and anyone who supports Russia by buying stuff off Russia. But by the way, US sanctions exemption that allows Hungary to continue importing Russian oil also applies to Slovakia, but it'll be valid for 1 year only. That's the Slovak economy minister, the minister of the economy there. Okay. So yeah, we're going to go really hard. Oh, by the way, our mates over here don't need to, this ruling doesn't apply to them. They are exempt for a year. And then you have US permanent representative to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, coming out and calling on the EU to act aggressively on the seizure of Russian assets in order to ensure Ukraine receives financial and military support for several years to come. So you guys need to do this. You need to do this. We've done this, by the way. We'll let these Europeans off. People I'm talking to, but that need to put more pressure on. Okay, you guys need to put more pressure on. Apart from Slovakia and Hungary, they don't need to put any pressure on Russia because they're our mates. And there's such confusion here. There's contradiction at the heart of this because Trump loves himself, people who are obsequious to him. Trump is an absolute victim to flattery and presence. So you either take him gold, as the Swiss just did, gold bar and gold Rolex thing, give that to him, they get exemptions. Viktor Orban goes in with sweet words for Trump and how much he loves him. And Caroline Levitt gets an exemption, same with Fitzo. Wonder what other kind of backhanders they gave to Trump. And at the same time, Congress and Matthew Whitaker are going hard on Russia. So, or telling others to go hard on Russia. I think, a bit of a map of contradictions. Now, peace talks with Russia have been suspended until the end of the year due to a lack of progress, according to the Deputy Foreign Minister Kyslytsya from Ukraine. This comes as Russia signaled willingness to resume negotiations. So far, Kiev has not responded. So that was November the 12th. I reported that sort of almost a week ago now. And then today we hear this. Zelensky is to visit Turkey to reinvigorate stalled negotiations with Russia. Now, either this is a case that Ukraine are in trouble, they're really finding it difficult, and they actually want to get to negotiations, or probably, as difficult as it is for Ukraine, it's probably more a case that they are wanting to signal to the US that they are dead behind negotiations and peace, that they're the ones that are serious about peace and Russia aren't. And so if Russia aren't going to be serious about this, you need to put more sanctions on them, because at the moment the US has started turning the screw in really significant ways. That congressional bill gets through and Trump acts on it, then that will be even greater for pressure on Russia and greater for Ukraine. And with Europe continuing to do what it does, and maybe India and China following through, then Russia's in serious trouble. And this is a time that Zelensky says, look, we're up for peace. We're trying to restart the peace negotiations. You can't say that we're not up for it. Meanwhile, we're blowing the crap out of their hydrocarbons industry and the power plants, and all these different screws are turning. Quote, we are preparing to reinvigorate negotiations, and we have developed solutions that we will propose to our partners, Zelensky has said. The Kremlin says no Russian officials will attend the Turkey talks. So, quote, for now, these contacts are taking place without Russian participation, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has said. So this is, essentially, this is perfect for Ukraine. They played that really, really well, which is, we want peace. We're going to go and do peace. US, are you hearing? Can you hear this Trump? We want peace. Yeah. So I'm Zelensky. Remember the guy that you shouted at, but now you get on okay with? Yeah, well, I really want peace. Thank you very much with Russia. So I'm just going to Turkey. Oh, the Russians aren't going, are they? Oh, the Russians don't want peace, do they? Oh, well, we'll just keep bombing them. So I don't know. You could see that as just really well played. Now, US presidential envoy Steve Witkoff will visit Turkey tomorrow to meet with Zelensky, according to Reuters. So again, brilliant. US are going to be involved with meeting with Ukraine in a way that is, again, perfect PR for Ukraine. The Ukrainian president earlier confirmed his Wednesday trip to Turkey aimed at ramping up negotiations tied to a ceasefire talks and prisoner exchanges. Unfortunately, Steve Witkoff is a prime plonker, but better him than no one. And that could be an opportunity for the Ukrainians to try and butter up Steve Witkoff, because at the moment he is exceptionally pro Russian. Now, NATO has said that it currently takes around 45 days to move a major force from Western Europe to its eastern flank because of weak infrastructure, mismatched rail systems, and slow bureaucracy, according to Financial Times. The EU and NATO now aim to slash the transit time to just 3 to 5 days, which would require major upgrades to roads, bridges, and railways, plus simplified border routes. This is part of this kind of safe funding, SAFE. I forget what it stands for, but the military funding that's being made available to EU states is about, well, no, sorry, it's NATO funding. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Although I'm sure that will be the case with EU funding for rearming. We'll also be looking at, there being money spent to allow there to be interoperability between the nations in the EU. NATO funding, 3.5% of the 5% of GDP expenditure is directly on military gear, and 1.5% is on infrastructure. That's because it's well known that if Europe went to war or NATO went to war, they would really struggle to get ground kits across Europe. You got bridges that wouldn't be able to sustain a weight. You got roads that are just too thin or not good enough here or whatever. And there's a real formal recognition here that it would take them 45 days to get a force across Europe that needed to get across, would need to get across in 3 to 5 days. That is evidently far, far from being good enough. Now, Zelensky today, he's been around a lot recently. He's got a very busy period at the moment. He's in Spain. I think he's met the royal family just now. Here he says, today I'm holding meetings in Spain. We expect another strong country will increase its support. We are working to ensure that the meeting with Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain results in agreements that will give us greater strength. Tomorrow I will hold meetings in Turkey. We are preparing to reinvigorate negotiations, doing everything possible to bring an end to the war. Closer is Ukraine's top priority. We are also working to restore POW exchanges and bring our prisoners of war home. On Thursday, I was instructed to prepare the staff meeting. I'm preparing several necessary legislative initiatives and principled swift decisions that our state needs. That's probably with regard to the corruption scandal. There's still a lot of talk that Andrei Yermak, the head of the presidential office, might get sacked or be asked to leave by people around Zelensky rather than Zelensky himself. I'm not sure. Lots of talk. But anyway, Spain's an interesting country by point of fact that it's a very big economy in terms of Europe. They don't spend enough on NATO or enough on their own defense as a percentage of GDP to qualify, for NATO. They are a nation that has been looking at whether 5% is going to be something they are going to commit to, really. And in fact, they are having sort of semi-formal discussions about NATO expenditure and thus, I guess, NATO membership going forward. So interesting things going on in Spain. So I think it's probably a good place for Zelensky to go. And it doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, there's talk there. Yeah, there's a little bit here. There's some more detail elsewhere, but there's actually quite a lot of defense cooperation that could go on between Spain and Ukraine. And in fact, there has been cooperation on manufacturing. I think Spain makes some Ukrainian stuff under license. So that kind of localization and manufacturing that we often talk about, stuff being made in Ukraine that's being funded by outside nations. There are also outside nations who are building stuff there that are Ukrainian weapons licensed to those countries to build. And so I think Spain does make, is it one of these mobility vehicles, I think possibly there? Zelensky now in Spain is meeting with weapons and defense tech manufacturers, focusing on radars, drones, and critical equipment to boost Ukraine's protection. He will also speak to Prime Minister Sanchez about strengthening both nations' defense industries. Lots of kit has been talked about, and I'll discuss that in my next military aid update. Now, he's recently, Zelensky, been to Greece as well, where he signed an energy deal. This will see natural gas come from Greece up to Ukraine, and that could get Ukraine out of a serious bind over the winter period because their own gas production facilities have been absolutely shellacked, and they're now operating at maybe 0% in terms of gas production. So they desperately need that assistance from Greece. So that's really good. And prior to that, because sorry, I've been away for some days. Prior to that, Canada added 13 individuals, 11 entities, and 100 ships to the sanctions list, targeting drone developers, cyber networks, and LNG, liquefied natural gas firms. Ottawa, capital of Canada, says it is aligned with the G7 strategy to choke off Russia's war funding and hybrid military capabilities. Good news there. And actually, Zelensky and Carney Zelensky said, "Thank you to Canada and Prime Minister Mark Carney for today's sanctions against Russia's drone program, digital infrastructure used for hybrid warfare, energy trade, and 100 Shadow Fleet ships, a decisive step that aligns with Ukraine's priorities and the unity of the G7. Russia only cares about pressure, and the sanctions adopted are a real investment in peace. We fully support this decision. It's good that it provides for further restrictions on trade and Russian energy resources, and we must completely deprive Moscow of its sources of profit." And on the same day, he also thanked the UK. "We are grateful to the UK and Prime Minister Starmer for their continued humanitarian and energy support to Ukraine and today's newly announced energy support package." So the UK announced an energy support package. "As Russia increases attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure, such solidarity is crucial." The UK also announced its plans to introduce a maritime services ban on Russian LNG trade, an important step to ramping up pressure and making it the aggressor pay the price for the war. "We expect all these measures to be realized swiftly. Thank you." So a number of nations really turning up to help Ukraine at an hour of need. It's interesting concerning the UK. This is Tom Homan, one of the Project 2025 guy. He's a border SAR, the guy that's essentially responsible really for ICE and whatnot. You've got Christy Noem, the Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, and you also have Tom Homan. These guys are responsible for all the brown-skinned people getting rounded up on the streets by an over-officious ICE. Anyway, he said this. So basically, under Trump, our closest allies, this is Ron Filikowski from the Midas Touch Network, saying, basically, under Trump, our closest allies are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Israel, Hungary, Pakistan, El Salvador, and Argentina. This is Tom Homan talking about the UK. So just in case you can't hear that, this is in response to the UK and indeed Canada now not sharing intelligence with the US in certain contexts vis-a-vis what's going on in the Caribbean. So the destruction of these boats, where the US is just blowing up these boats and essentially murdering people in the Caribbean. And the UK said, look, this is not justifiable. There is no legal justification for this. And so therefore, we are not going to continue to share this kind of intelligence with you. It's not the end of the world for the Americans, but the UK does have a presence in the Caribbean. There's a lot of former territories there and places that have associations with the UK. And so we are pretty active in the area in terms of intelligence. And you've also got the Canadians, and you've also got the Dutch, who have said that they are no longer sharing intelligence as much with the Americans. You've got the Colombians have said that too, the Colombians in the Caribbean region. Tom Homan's answer to this: "I'm out of my lane. I'm a border guy, but the UK is not a friend to the country, not a friend to the president. So the UK's just been dumped there." Nice one. Thanks, Tom. You need to speak to Pete Hegseth and the Secretary of State. But yeah, okay. So yeah, but just in case you were wondering whether that was an isolated opinion, here is Scott Jennings on CNN, someone I really do not like. But anyway, do you think I'd give a rip about what some country in Europe thinks about us policing our backyard? I mean, it's chaotic, but you know, the idea is, yeah, I like what some said. Okay, if you want to police your backyard, police them. Don't blow them up. Blow them up is not policing. That's murder. That's not what police do. At least it's not what they should do, unless you live in an outright dictatorship. Just oh my goodness. Anyway, there you go. Now we hear that two German MEPs, members of European Parliament, met organisers of EU-sanctioned Russian influence network Voice of Europe in Moscow in May. The meetings reportedly were set up through a peace foundation that passes guest data to Russian military intelligence. So yet again, we see that some Germans are compromised, even though Germany as a whole is insanely supportive of Ukraine, or at least politically at the moment, and is coming up with the goods with regard to massive funding and military aid support to Ukraine. And yet there are movers and shakers in the German political landscape who really are within the Russian sphere of influence. Now, talking about the Russian sphere of influence, here is a speaker for the Czech parliament, Oramura, who is incredibly anti-Ukrainian. He tore down the Ukrainian flag from, I believe, Parliament when he took over, when the new coalition took over. Czech Parliament Speaker removed Ukraine's flag on his first day in office, and now Ukrainian flags have appeared. So we've already heard that they dropped flags from windows in the Parliament from people whose offices were, members of opposition parties and whatnot. They were draping Ukrainian flags from their windows in response to what Ohumura did. And now Ukrainian flags have appeared on a fence near his home with Ukrainian symbols painted on nearby sidewalks and street infrastructure. So there you go. So in fact, you can't see it there. That picture doesn't. There's another picture with someone zoomed in on that picture of his home, but there's basically a fence outside it with a bunch of flags draped on it. And so there you go. There is a bit of a response against him. And speaking of which, so in Slovakia, Robert Fico is the prime minister there. He's pretty pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian. A group of Slovak high schoolers walked out on the prime minister. So the prime minister comes to speak to the school. Robert Fico ranted against helping Ukraine, according to local media. And then when Fico claimed the EU was spending 140 billion euros to prolong the war and told students to go fight if you're such heroes, they drowned him out with jingling keys and left the hall. I freaking love this. Good on him. Good on him. Good young, idealistic, protest-oriented people getting up and saying, screw you, Fico. I love that. I love it. Okay. Ukrainian intelligence come out and said that the Russian economy's dependence on energy and metal exports, most of which are sold to China, make it increasingly vulnerable to fluctuations in demand in the Chinese market, and increases its dependence on Beijing, which is absolutely right. So Russia has become this vassal state of China, and if China say jump, Russia has to say how high. And if they are entirely dependent on far fewer people to buy their stuff, then that means that dependence makes them very vulnerable to changes in behavior, in prices, and all sorts there. Now, speaking of which, US Treasury Department issued a license for certain transactions involving Lukoil's retail service stations and contracts for the sale of the firm's international assets until December the 13th. In other words, the US has given permission to Lukoil, that even though they're sanctioned, to do certain things like offload, divest their interest. A separate waiver for deals pertaining to Lukoil's entities in Bulgaria was extended through April the 29th. The move comes as the US government balances its desire to maintain lower oil prices with its goal of pressuring Putin to agree to a Ukraine peace deal, and with the Treasury's move putting pressure on Russia to bring them to the negotiating table. So I don't know how much of this is letting certain entities off and how much of this is just realistically allowing for Lukoil to be able to divest many of its entities. Now, China, says Bloomberg, has sharply reduced imports of Russian oil due to fears of sanctions. So going back to this idea that Ukraine is dependent on China, if China then reduces its imports of Russian oil, then that really puts Russia in a bit of a bind. Due to the fears of sanctions, the reduction could reach about 2/3 of previously supplied volumes. This has a noticeable impact on export flows from Russia. So state-owned private refiners' inflows are at a 17-week low, says this chart, Kepler chart there. And you can see not looking good for Russia there. There's any more detail? No. Now, in the same vein, Russia's seaborne crude oil exports fell to a 4-week average of 3.36 million barrels per day by November the 16th, the lowest since August. Gross export revenues dropped to $1.2 billion per week, the weakest since April 2023. US sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, combined with lower prices, are curbing flows and delaying discharges in Asia. So there's a real double whammy here, because it says, as you can see, the 4-week average of 3.36 million barrels per day, which is the lowest since August. Okay, it's not too far back. But actually, not only are they selling less, then they're moving less, they're exporting less oil. But the price per barrel is now, according to some figures we discussed this morning, is at a loss. They're now in loss-making territory. So 3.36 million barrels per day at, as I said this morning, somewhere between $4 and $8 per barrel loss. That is Russia paying every day to export their own oil. And the reason why that has to happen is because they have to keep the flow going, because they can't stop the extraction. They can't stop the pipelines, because the pipelines will freeze over winter, and they don't have the ability to stop the extraction, to shut off the oil from coming out of the ground. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the maintenance crews and all sorts. They're in this really precarious situation where they're selling less oil, and the oil that they are selling is at incredibly low prices, arguably below break even. and yet they still keep having to do it. So even if they make a loss, they have to continue to make a loss just to keep the stuff flowing. Yeah, in a bit of a bind, as I say. Now, this is the foreign minister from Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, speaking to the rest is politics. Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart from the UK. I really like these two. I listen to an awful lot of the rest is politics output. Here is Sikorski. So there's an interesting admission or revelation there that we're basically, I mean, of course, it depends on the EU actually getting the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, but that's sustenance for 3 years. So they can support the war for another 3 years. What can Russia do? Now, of course, there are other things to talk about other than just money, like literally infrastructure, like energy infrastructure. You can have all the money in the world, but if you've got no energy, no ability to heat your homes during the winter, then you're in trouble. And to power your business and your industry. So there are other things than just pure money. There's logistics, practicalities, and resources. But essentially, can Russia sustain their direction of travel for another 3 years? So he said, I'm in favor of the European Union starting to have some defense capability of our own so that we don't have to call on the United States in every emergency. We should be capable of sorting out some warlord in Libya or the Balkans next time around. As long as Germany is in NATO and the EU, I fear German pacifism more than I fear German rearmament. So he says Turkey is now more integrated with the EU than Britain, which is sad. Ouch, that hurts. And both of these two, because Alistair Campbell, the guy you can see on the right there, Rory Stewart, you can't see. Alistair Campbell's left wing. He was Tony Blair's spin doctor guy, communications guy. And then Rory Campbell was a One Nation conservative, but both of them are pro-EU. And to have Radoslaw Sikorski from Poland saying, look, Turkey's now more integrated in the EU than you guys, and they aren't very integrated at all. So yeah, what a shame. Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service warned Belgium it will be held accountable, so it won't seem enough if it seizes frozen Russian assets, calling EU funds a thieves' stash and claiming Europe's broke and wants to pay for Ukrainian grain with stolen Russian money. Yeah, well, tough luck, mate. Go and cry in a corner. However, things are difficult in the EU because, of course, Viktor Orban. Here he was on TV almost a week ago saying Russia wants to occupy 4 Ukrainian regions before making peace with Kyiv. In an interview with ATV, Prime Minister Orban said that the reason is that the 2022 Istanbul Agreement was smashed by, quote, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, I could read all of what he says here, but I just wanted to point out this one phrase he uses. You will note, if you've been following the Russians at all for some time, that they refer to the Anglo-Saxons essentially as, the British, maybe the British and Americans, maybe British, Americans, German. But these are the guys that are to blame, say the Russians all the time, for the woes of, I don't know, Europe, the world, Ukraine war, etc., etc. If Viktor Orban is on television publicly blaming the Anglo-Saxons, he is essentially lifting Russian propaganda straight out of the mouth of Putin and those in the Kremlin. In response, Russia decided to occupy not only Luhansk and Donetsk, but also Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, he said. He also stated that the American-Russian summit in Budapest is delayed, but it is on the agenda, which are curious statements from the leader of a country that is both in the EU and in NATO. There you go. Right. The other day, the Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev met with Vladimir Putin. They did sign a declaration elevating their relationships to the level of, quote, comprehensive strategic partnership and alliance. This is slightly worrying because I've been hoping that Kazakhstan, because they've been actually keeping convoys of trucks going from China to Russia at the border and checking them and making it difficult. And there has been moods from Kazakhstan that have been kind of antithetical to really close cooperation with Russia. For them to then sign this declaration, I don't know the details, but it is worrying that Russia might be twisting Kazakhstan's arm in order to get it back into the fold. Now, a single British shipping firm has moved 40% of Russia's Yamal liquefied natural gas exports in early 2025, while the UK claimed to be cutting Russian war funding. This is so common, this kind of story, and it's so frustrating. Like I keep telling you, unfortunately, morality plays second fiddle to profit. And if there are loopholes or ways to easily evade following the law to the letter, then people will do it. In this case, it's a British firm that has done this. I mean, we've heard of so many entities, but it's just goodness me. Anyway, the UK will finally ban these services starting in 2026, 3 years after banning direct imports. Now, I don't know whether that was just negligence or loopholes that were able to be kept open due to money changing hands. I don't know what's gone on here, but as long as that is stopped forthwith, imagine, how much money has been able to get to Putin to continue the war due to this kind of behavior. Really frustrating. Now, in case you didn't know, a GB News journalist called Beverly Turner recently interviewed Trump just after he said he was going to sue the BBC. And by the way, that's an interesting story because the guy that released the memo, Michael Prescott, that accused the BBC of splicing together two comments of Trump to create a narrative, himself in the memo spliced together two comments of Trump to create a narrative. It's absolutely incredible. A journalist from the New World, used to be the New European, which I used to buy very often. He found this out, and it's now out there. I'll try and find this for you actually, because I think it is pretty important for this. So here we go. I thought I'd play this to you just in case you weren't aware of this.
I've done some amazing journalism or some great investigation here. I really do. I love to hype myself up. But I was going to do a bit of analysis on the whole BBC row and this dossier. And of course, the whole centre of the row is whether Panorama misquoted Donald Trump. And they took a couple of little things he said in an hour-long speech and put them together. And the allegation is that they misleadingly suggested that Trump incited the January the 6th riots, which, of course, he incited. Congressional reports found this. Courts have found this. There are reams of evidence for this. But I went and read the quote as it was in this dossier produced by this external advisor, Michael Prescott. And the quote just sort of looked a little bit odd to me because I've read this speech and I just sort of thought, hey, I'll just look up where this is. And when I looked in the actual speech, the transcript's online. Anyone could have done this at any time, including the BBC.
I thought I had. This is why I should put my hands up and express a degree of embarrassment here, because I thought I had done it, and yet I missed what you're about to describe.
Yeah, and so Michael Prescott has him say, we're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be with you. I know that everyone here will soon be marching to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make our voices heard. Now, Trump does say all of those words, but not in those order. And in between, he says things like, you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing. Now, those all sound like threats to me. Those all sound quite important things. But
so Michael Prescott says the BBC are really disingenuous because they took these two quotes and put them together when actually this is what happened. And when Michael Prescott said this is what happened, he's taken these quotes and missed out the threatening parts of what Trump said, and then took them out and spliced together all the nice bits. So he's literally done the exact thing that he has accused the BBC of doing, yet no one's going to Michael Prescott. You should be out, you should be castigated, you should be sued by Donald Trump, you should be blah 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 blah, because he's one of theirs. It's just absolutely incredible.
Even if they weren't, this whole complaint is about altering quotes. And even in print, there are ways you show you've altered a quote. You put in an ellipsis, you break it up. This was said as exactly what Trump said. And so this bloody dossier that supposedly says that Panorama has done this mortal sin against broadcasting, that Trump's suing for $1 billion, has done something at least as bad, and I think arguably worse. And it took me to notice it. I actually
just for hang on a minute. You've won a Pulitzer Prize in the past. Stop it with the self-deprecation, James Paul. You've won a Pulitzer Prize in the past. No one. I'm less surprised than you are. But I mean, to be clear, this Prescott character has abridged a quote. He has edited a quote and not made it clear while attacking the BBC for editing quotes and not making it clear.
Yeah, and in a dossier that has brought down the two most senior executives of the BBC and started an international incident. And potentially, let's not forget, the BBC is publicly funded. Any money it has to spend defending itself against Trump is money out of our pockets as license fee payers. Now, I want the BBC to stand up for itself. I'll spend that. But if all of this is based off a misleading edit itself, I think that's a scandal.
Just absolutely incredible, isn't it? Just that just incredible. Anyway, there you go. So that's what happened there in a little bit more detail, and then that gets us back to here. So a quick reminder that then what Trump said was, I'm going to sue the BBC for $1 billion. He then upped it to $5 billion, but in the meantime, he said everyone should watch GB News instead of BBC, and then he was interviewed by Beverly Turner on GB News. Remember, GB News shares in that are held by Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has got connections to Russia, as I've shown, and as the Byline Times has very explicitly shown. And he is someone who is, I think, what he said, along with Nathan Gill, the guy that was found to have taken bribes from Russia. Nigel Farage has said Russian talking points in European Parliament, so on and so forth, and on TV. So anyway, there's this kind of idea that GB News is this sort of Fox News, but even worse, like maybe even like far less professional, even more propagandistic, overtly to reform, since the reform leader literally has a show on the channel. And is not regulated because it's not called a news show, even though it's on GB News, it's got news in the title and blah, blah, whatever. And Beverly Turner then gets this amazing opportunity to interview Donald Trump and gives him this utterly softball, obsequious interview, which is typically like vomit inducing. So a quick reminder that GB News journalist Beverly Turner, who recently interviewed Trump, is a regular sympathizer with the Kremlin view of the UK and Ukraine and a peddler of Kremlin planted conspiracy theories. No wonder she gets a White House press pass. This tells you who GB News are, in case you are someone that likes to watch a bit of GB News because they, I don't know, slag off immigrants or something. Bev Turner, special envoy to Putin, feeling our pain. What strange times, as she empathizes with Kirill Dmitriev, saying, as I was flying over London on the way back to Russia from the US, I reflected on the struggle of the British people against uncontrolled immigration, grooming gangs, and he says, and the mark of the beast digital ID, all while suffering under the most unpopular prime minister in UK history, Starmer, which Bev Turner, as an objective news as a journalist at GB News, just says, yeah, special envoy to Putin, feeling our pain. What strange times. Since the long speech he gave on the eve of invading, #Putin has never wavered from his reasoning, a rather sentimental but logical assessment of Ukraine's identity as a vital part of Russia, and his fury that America, via Victoria Nuland, installed Zelensky, as proven by the damning audio of her admitting this. I come back to this every time we discuss this bloodbath on GB News. Again, bloodbath is a term that Trump has used before, so it's very particular phraseology going on here. Convinced me that Putin would never stop expanding into Europe if he is given Ukraine. Make that make sense. We are committing to a 100-year war so that Ukraine is less Russian. Yeah, that's the journalist on GB News interviewing Donald Trump. Just let this sink in, she says in another one. Ukraine definitely has America-funded biolabs. Sound familiar? Wuhan? Why? Why would America be funding biolabs in Ukraine on the border of the trigger-happy man who is terrified of Western invasion? The arrogance of the USA, not a Putin apologist, she has to say at the end. I'm not a Putin apologist. But Putin apologism. Fabricated disinformation coming from the Kremlin. Biolabs. I mean, goodness gracious. Absolutely staggering. Bev Turner says, nobody knows what happened to Navalny. He could have had a heart attack for all we know. So do you find it bizarre that every political leader came out immediately to accuse Putin of murder? Those bloody conspiracy theorists. Whatever happened to it's taken the shine off, blah, 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 blah. So she's like calling into question that Navalny was actually poisoned. Yep, that's who GB News have got anchoring their shows and talking to President Trump. Brilliant. Or indeed, not brilliant. That sucks. Anyway, I just wanted to, in fact, no, before I go there, I think I might go on to talk a little bit about actually connections to Russia still in the UK. So JCB are these, what we call diggers, these excavators. They manufacture them and other things like batteries. They're a massive company in the UK. Huge Brexiteers as well. Very, very supportive of Leave campaign. the guy that the Bamford family that owns JCB. JCB has an annual turnover of £6.5 billion, and the owners, the Bamford family, have a net worth of £9.45 billion. So thanks for clarifying what you mean by a small business, Nigel. MB, the owner, is being investigated and could owe HMRC of £500 million. MB2, the firm defied sanctions on Russia and continued trading. No wonder Nigel likes them. So JCB still trading with Russia by all accounts.
The first thing I want to do is say a big thank you, a very big public thank you to Lord Bamford and JCB Excavators for their recent donation to us of £200,000. And I'm very thankful indeed for that. And they've given a lot of money, over £10 million to the Conservatives over the years, but they're giving us some money because they know that we are pro-entrepreneurship. They know that we are pro-startup. They know that we are pro-small business.
So pro-startups, pro-small business, they know this, says this massive company that's given us a whole bunch of money after giving the Conservatives an even bigger bunch of money over time. But that's a huge amount they've given. And then just if you're wondering, I just thought I'd throw this in here for a bit more politics, UK style.
All I would say about the high street is one of the things in the high street that does still survive is the bookmaker's shop, which actually for a lot of lonely people is a place they can go in, meet people. There are 22 million people. 22 million people a week have a bet of some kind in this country.
So I just find it really interesting that the leader of this political party stands up and says, oh, do you know our high streets are dying at the moment, which is true. Internet is killing the high street. But it's all right because actually betting shops, famously, betting shops are doing pretty well or have been doing well. And there are complaints that there are too many betting shops open, that some betting shops, there is so many per mile or whatever. And of course, this is a way that working class people particularly can lose a lot of money. And so it's a bit controversial. But he's standing up there saying, oh, it's a lovely place where lonely people can meet. You're wondering, hey, why does he suddenly have stats on betting in the UK? Why is he suddenly standing up and saying 22 million? Where's he got that from? That's an interesting thing to just throw out there.
Lonely people is a place they can go in, meet people. There are 22 million people. 22 million people a week have a bet of some kind in this country. Yes, there are a few problem gamblers, but there are problem drinkers, there are problem drug takers, there are problem everythings. And I worry that if she puts up gaming duty significantly in this budget, not only will it close hundreds, maybe thousands of high street bookmakers, but I genuinely wonder whether Clacton Pier and the other 400 seaside villages and towns that have innocent amusements where kids put in tuppence, you know, those maddening machines. You always think you're about to win big, don't you? I still think I'm going to win big. I never do. And my worry is it will close all those down too.
He's not worried about small amusements with the 2p machines. He doesn't give a damn about them. So betting shops. So what you learn from this is betting shops are great for mental health of struggling people. Most drug takers are not a problem. Kids put tuppence in slot machines to get mega rich. And Farage probably has a gambling industry donor. That's where that's going. 100% he's got a gambling industry donor. So there you go. Anyway, money. Farage has registered a total of 280,500 for 4 hours a month as a brand ambassador for a company selling gold bars. So he gets £280,500 a month for doing 4 hours of work a month as a brand ambassador for a gold bullion company. And he, during these speeches, he said that this is his campaign agenda. He thinks £10 an hour minimum wage for young people it may have to be lowered. Young people are getting paid too much. £10 an hour is too much. I get £280,500 for 4 hours a month. £10 an hour is too much for you young people. Damn you young people. Anyway, that's who this guy is. I just wanted to have a little bit of a rant about him. But there you go. Sorry, just got a little bit confused about where I was. So yeah, it just absolutely enrages me. And he's a guy that is going to probably get into power in the next election. And he's a guy that's been an architect of our economic woes at the moment. New research from Stanford, The Bank of England, King's College London finds that Brexit has hit the UK hard. GDP is down 6 to 8% since the referendum. Roughly £2,000 per person per year is lost. Investment is down 12 to 18% and a drag that compounds over time. Employment and productivity each down 3 to 4%, says Tris Osborne, MP here. So, you know, it is a real, I mean, this is the, you've got the, you have the pandemic obviously throws all of our stats into a bit of a spin, but research has been done by reputable establishments to show that Brexit is going to be a challenge. And actually, I'm going to finish off this video. I'm not going to do my American section. I'm just going to finish off talking a bit about British politics, because actually what you're going to find is that Reform are going to get in unless something big changes with Labour. And so Labour have to kind of pick something, to pick a topic area to pick themselves back up and differentiate themselves from the Tories, from Reform, and to have an agenda that people can get behind, that's big and bold. Because if they're going to keep trying to do the same thing, tinker around the edges, they're going to lose out to the big populists. So there's a few things to say about Brexit that I think are really important. I'll be interested, as many European viewers here, what you think. But anyway, this is one of the best arguments against Brexit I've ever seen, says Nick Tyrone. This is with reference to Andrew Neil, who's a massive Brexiteer, political right-winger who used to have a show on the BBC. The UK's post-Brexit payments to the EU will top. So we've had this kind of divorce agreement coming out of the EU. We have to pay them divorce procedures, basically. To, you know, we have to pay them things that we still owed into the pot, that by coming out we will no longer be able to pay, but we're obliged still to pay. So the post-Brexit payments to the EU will top £50 billion. We've already paid £44 billion since leaving in 2020, according to the ONS. Another £8 billion is due. This is the exit deal the useless Tories negotiated. Now, he is a former, massive Tory guy. At the time, they denied it would even be £40 billion. Some of us pointed out it would be more. The EU took hopelessly unprepared Tory governments for a ride, running circles around them and our civil service in negotiations, leaving the rest of us to pick up the enormous tab. Now, some people say, well, that's a good argument as to why we should never have left. People like Nigel Farage will take this and say, we just did it badly. We left badly. That it's the Conservatives' fault for us having a useless process of leaving the EU, even though, no, we still would have had to pay that. And actually, they kind of left in a no-deal scenario, which is broadly what you wanted, Nigel Farage. So you saying that the Tories did a really bad job, they pretty much did what you wanted them to do. So I find that highly disingenuous, but that will be his position. So breaking, the City finally admits it. The money machine is misfiring. City blames Brexit for UK's £20 billion productivity headache. Poor output since the Leave vote has landed Rachel Reeves with a bigger than forecast budget spending gap. So it's not just like the politicians of other parties saying that, oh, we're in this predicament because of Brexit. Actually, you've got research institutes, you've got the city, London City, and financial, figures and whatnot saying this. Charles Tannock says, I can't resist the tad of Schadenfreude, as I was accused of scaremongering about predicting all the negative consequences of Brexit a decade ago. Always knew Brexiteers had no hard evidence as to substantiate their sunlit uplands claim. All done on a wing and a prayer. The UK was sold a pup. UK productivity has crashed since Brexit. £1 trillion in banking assets have fled to the EU. City output, once the driver of UK growth, is now dragging it down. The result is a £20 billion black hole in the public finances. Even Chancellor Rachel Reeves now admits that Brexit caused a slump, but refuses to fix it by rejoining the single market. This isn't just about bankers. When productivity falls, everyone pays. Lower wages, higher taxes, worse public services. Brexit didn't take back control. It took away Britain's future earnings. The money machine is misfiring, and Labour's red lines mean it stays that way. So what she's saying is that Labour should really consider rejoining. Now, actually, this is where I'm going to leave you with this. That Labour have a very slim chance of doing well in the next election, and the best, I think, thing they can do is try and go down a really bold route. They've got a massive majority in Parliament at the moment. It's not going to be the case in a few years' time. So they should try and ram home really big things. And now we know that publicly, most of the public is behind rejoining the EU. Although you've got Conservatives and Reform voters, looking very much against that, but actually you could unite the country. Sorry, you could unite a significant portion of the country behind an agenda that seeks to rejoin. Now, would the EU have the UK back? And how doable is it? How practical is it? But actually, economically speaking, the UK is really suffering from not being in the EU. I talked about this with regard to accessing the defense funding the other day, the safe defense funding in Europe, 150 billion, and then maybe up to 800 billion. Well, Europe, because EU, because they don't really give a damn about us anymore. We're not in the EU. So why should they be looking after our defense industry? Is saying to us as a nation, if your defense industry wants to access this kind of funding, you need to pay us this amount of money, and you need to pay an admin fee of this amount of money, 150 million pounds admin fee or euros, and then 4 to 6 billion in blah, blah, blah. And we're like, seriously? No, screw you. But then we're like, but actually, we really need that. And, we're now out of this massive trade bloc, biggest one in the world. And we're kind of this minnow swimming in the sea of sharks. And you've got the US bullying us with trade negotiations. And now the EU is flexing against us. And we are outside of that comfort blanket, that security blanket, economic security blanket, and we are suffering. So anyway, what the other thing you might, and this is where it's kind of leading here, the other thing you might see, as well as this idea that we could rejoin the EU, is electoral reform. Now, I campaigned for electoral reform back when the Lib Dems went into coalition with the Tories back in 2010. And as going into coalition, one of the things they asked for was electoral reform to change from first past the post to some kind of proportional representation. And PR or electoral reform was winning until David Cameron realized that it was winning in the polls, and he phoned up 4 different newspaper editors and said, we're losing, we can't have electoral reform because then the Tories will in fact, at the time it benefited the Conservatives and Labour, the establishment parties. As soon as you reach a kind of threshold, a tipping point, then first past the post works in your favor. I'm not going to explain first past the post, go and look it up if you don't understand. But the UK, the US, and mainly other nations that were in the British Empire, unless they've reformed, have got forms of first past the post. No new nation takes on first past the post, which is interesting. It's a suboptimal voting system, but we have it. And what that meant at the time is that David Cameron, when this was going to be voted on in a referendum, David Cameron didn't want first past the post to be got rid of because it was beneficial to Conservatives and Labour, not beneficial for smaller parties. So he phoned up these 4 big newspaper editors and said, you need to campaign against PR tomorrow. And they started doing that next day, and then the polls changed. And then lo and behold, we lost the vote, the referendum. But anyway, first past the post, the present political system would have the Conservatives absolutely decimated in the next election, the Reform winning almost a majority, but probably going into a coalition with the Conservatives, depending on what kind of polling you look at. So actually, first past the post, while it really hurt Reform in previous elections, in 2016 election, they got no MPs, eventually one defected, Douglas Carswell, and that was 4 million votes. 4 million votes, and they got 0 or 1 MP. So Reform were crying out for electoral reform, but now they've got to this critical mass of voters. First past the post now works in their favor, and it hurts smaller parties. So first past the post would screw over the Green Party, would screw over the actually first past the post is good for the SNP in Scotland as well, weirdly. So in Scotland, the SNP have reached that critical mass, and they had, I remember I looked at one of the elections, they had 56,000 people. I think it was the same one as 4 million for Reform, that was then UKIP. 4 million votes got them no MPs, or 1 MP. 56,000 votes in Scotland got the SNP 1 MP. So they do really well out of first past the post, the SNP. But anyway, if you go onto PR, this is what it would actually look like. And this might be in favor of, Labour would do better, Greens would do better, and you could get a coalition of Greens, Labour, Lib Dems, and maybe SNP, maybe Plaid Cymru, the Welsh there, that would get a progressive alliance over the halfway line. And so you might see Labour do one or two things. One, electoral reform. and 2, push to rejoin the EU. Be interesting. It could well happen. Anyway, that's enough from me. That was a bit of a big one because I went down the UK electoral side of things. Anyway, that's enough from me. You guys take care of yourselves. I will speak to you soon. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. And I appreciate that. And I'll speak to you tomorrow.